a color wheel that I had here in the studio, and the color wheel shows the full spectrum of visible color that we're able to see, but positioned in this circle, in which there are three primary colors: red, yellow, and blue, secondary colors, and tertiary colors in between. And the reason I'm showing this to you, because the colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel are called complementary colors. These colors create the highest contrast, but also when you mix them together, they neutralize each other. So we are actually going to use pairs of colors that are similar to complementary color pairs to create our grays. To begin, I'm going to use some pairs of oranges and blues. Now I'm using this palette of paints, so I have many different kinds of oranges and many different kinds of blue. To start with, I'm going to use what's a pigment that's called a deep golden, which looks like this in my palette. And I'm going to add a little bit more water to it so it's a little bit more transparent. And I'm going to place it in my first square. So I'm going to keep this reasonably organized so that you guys, it's easy for you to see which colors I'm using and what grays do they. So this is an ultramarine blue that I have. I'm mixing it with water so that it's nice and transparent. I'm going to mix them together and you can see the color beginning to change. Now if I use a little bit more yellow or a little bit more of the golden, it becomes more greenish. So I need to use just a touch more ultramarine to make a kind of a perfect gray. Here I'm going to add a little bit more. And that, so there we go. That's kind of a nice gray that I've created. And that gray is going to go in the middle. I'm going to make it a little more neutral, a little more orange. That gray is going to go in the middle. And that's a really beautiful neutral gray, very rich, and kind of you can use it in different ways. However, there's more than just making a gray. What I want to show you is how you could make this golden orange to become a little bit more neutral, to move towards the gray but not quite yet become a gray. Or if you wanted a really warm gray, then this is, so then I would use a little bit more golden orange than the ultramarine, and then I would have a tone that looks something like this. So it's more like a brown, but it also has like tints. It's like a cooler brown, has tints of the ultramarine in it. And it's a really nice pigment. And vice versa, I could also make a cooler gray by using a little bit more ultramarine and less golden orange. So my color would be something like this. It's really beautiful, very nice and cool gray. And of course there's all kinds of gradations in between that you could make, but for now I'm just going to show you the three versions. So the neutral gray, somewhere that you can decide it's somewhere in the middle, like really neutral gray, not too cool, not too warm. And then a color that you mix by adding a little bit more of the blue or a little bit more of the golden orange. So I'm going to label the colors so that you know what I'm using. So this is golden orange and this is ultramarine blue. Now your pigments may have slightly different names and you can experiment with the different oranges that you have. This one's called Titian Red, but it looks pretty much like a carrot, and I'm gonna put it so here. This is a Prussian blue. It's very different than ultramarine. It's much more of a cooler, kind of greener blue. I may have gone a little bit too greenish on my blue, so as I'm mixing them, it is turning a little more greenish, kind of a greenish gray that I'm getting. You can see here, definitely a neutral color, but when you compare it to the other to the other gray, this looks very green, right? So this here was Prussian blue and Titian red. Some of the pigments that you have are like pure, and some of them are composed of other pigments. They're kind of mixes or blends. And when you understand, when you start mixing your pigments, you can see how the composition of that pigment affects the mixing. So for example, this Titian red that looks very orangey might have some yellow tints in it, and when we're mixing it, all those yellow tints play a role. So instead of a bright orange, I'm going to use this raw sienna, which has a kind of a yellowish tint, looks like that. And I'm going to mix it with something that's called Blue Lake. It's a gorgeous gray. I just made it really beautiful. But you can adjust the value of the color just by the amount of water that you add to it. Sienna and ultramarine makes for a really gorgeous gray. And I don't know if you can see this in the video or not, but this is a gray we made with burnt sienna and ultramarine, and this is a gray we made with ultramarine and golden orange. So it's the same blue, right? But this gray is more neutral, and this one's a little bit greenish because of the yellow in the pigment. Look at the range of the browns we have created. With a little more water, this will create such beautiful skin tone tints. And you can see I'm trying to get the color reasonably even in my square, just so I can see the pigment clearly and it's not affected as much by the value changes. And so far I have been combining a warmer pigment with a cooler pigment, but now I've mixed both pigments are really warm. This is a reddish orange and this is a violet blue, and you can see how my gray almost looks a little bit more violet. It's very, very warm. What I notice is that when I use one of the tones is a more neutral tone, like for example burnt umber, burnt sienna, I get or raw sienna right here, I get really neutral grays in here. Sometimes when and this one was also a pretty neutral gray, but it has more of a greenish tone because of the yellow in my original orange, while this right here has more of a reddish tone because of the reddish tone in the orange and the reddish tone in the blue. It's more of a violet, overall violet grays, and these are overall kind of greenish grays, right? So your grays can have a range in them. So you tend to use a little bit more of the lighter pigment than you do of the darker pigment. So with the yellow and purple, it's going to be common that you would be using more yellow and less purple to make your neutral pigment. So even in the moments when you don't mix perfect grays, I hope that this exercise will invite you to find new combinations of colors that you could mix. Manufacturers and different companies of paint may have slight variations in the colors. This exercise is a little bit like taking your colors out for a brunch or lunch, just like you would take someone that you didn't know yet out to eat and you're curious about them. So keep being curious about your color. For example, emerald green, it's like almost full in my colors, even though cobalt is almost empty. You can see, like, here's my cobalt empty, here's my emerald green completely full, but it's such a beautiful pigment and it was such a beautiful neutral colors that I was able to mix with it. It's like I just met this pigment that was in my palette all along. It's a really nice pairing. Don't they do this with wine and different foods? It's like you're trying to pair these things so that when they're paired, it's like they sing together. So it's a little bit tricky finding the place of perfectly neutral, right? You can already tell with my other colors. So which one is more neutral, this one or this one? When we place them next to each other, we can see the greenish tone in my original choice, right? However, when I first choose it, that seems to me to look really neutral. Make your colors transparent. Let the paper illuminate those colors for you. This is also a practice in how much water, how much pigment for each of these colors to add. If you were to compare these grays, they all look different. There's very few that would overlap. When you do this with your own pigments, it will just expand your palette for you. You're gonna discover so many new variations and mixes that you can use in your paintings. I hope this tutorial was helpful to you, and I look forward to seeing the mixes from the colors in your palettes.